right, welcome to Season 3, Episode 4 of the Database Podcast. I'm Dr. Molly Stewart, Director of Research and Analytics Services here at Education Analytics, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Vice President of Interoperability Solutions, Rosh Dhanawade, and also Tom Reitz, who's one of our data engineers. We work with school districts on interoperability and data quality using the EdFi data standard. And through this work, we've come to realize there are at least 3 different languages being spoken by people in this space: the language of databases and code, the language of teaching, learning, and educational leadership, and the language of research, data science, and statistics. This podcast aims to bridge the gaps among those 3 general areas because the more we understand about how each group conceptualizes data-related topics, the more progress we can make towards solutions for educators and students that fully take advantage of best practices and cutting-edge knowledge in each of these fields of work.
Like Molly mentioned, we're joined today by staff data engineer Tom Reitz. Tom is key instrument in the work that we do here and has created 2 tools that are kind of going to be at the center of our talk today that enable us to load data from raw data sources into our data pipelines through EdFi. I have some fond memories of doing this myself in my previous role, and I'll love to hear Tom's opinions and thoughts about this. So thanks for joining us, Tom.
Glad to be here. Really nice.
All right. So do you want to give us a little bit about your background, how you came to EA, and kind of what you do here?
Sure. So I'm a staff data engineer here at Education Analytics. I've been here about 3 years now. And my background in kind of educationally is computer science and math. And before this job, I worked as kind of a web application developer, some cloud deployment, and worked with APIs a little bit. So a tech background, but I'm newer to education since coming to EA. So definitely a lot to learn in that regard.
So we're primarily going to talk about Earthmover and Lightbeam today, which are tools that you developed. So let's just do like a real basic primer, technical primer for folks so that they kind of have the context for later discussion.
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. Earthmover and Lightbeam they have a few things in common, and then they're different. So the things that are in common, they're both command line tools. They are both written in Python. And then the way you configure them and tell them what to do is in a configuration language called YAML. So those things are all common to both. But now what they do is quite different, actually. Earthmover is for data transformation. So it works with typically CSV files, but really any tabular data, including database connections and other tabular sources. And it executes transformation instructions to turn that data into really any text data type, but typically we use it to turn that into JSON for EdFi. So that's Earthmover. And then Lightbeam is a tool for working with an EdFi API and communicating with it. Primarily, we use it to send these JSON payloads that we create with Earthmover to an EdFi API. But also it can extract data from an EdFi API. It can even validate JSON that you have against the Swagger or OpenAPI specification of an EdFi API and make sure that what you have is valid. So it's a kind of a Swiss Army knife for working with EdFi. And if all of that was way too technical and not useful, I think a good analogy, or how I like to think of it, is if EdFi is a language like Spanish, and the API is a communication mechanism like, say, a telephone. Earthmover helps you translate from other languages to Spanish, and Lightbeam helps you pick up the phone and call someone and transmit that Spanish to them.
That's a great analogy. I like that. Can you tell us, like, why were these things created?
Yeah. So essentially, when I started at EA, our data engineering team was working on Stadium, our Enable Data Union framework, for building a data warehouse off of EdFi. And that was working full steam ahead. We had partners on board who were using an EdFi-based data warehouse. But most of that information would come from an SIS, and it was around enrollment and attendance and behavior and things like that. Assessment data, though, typically comes from not the SIS, from an assessment vendor or some other source. And A few assessment vendors have EdFi integrations, but most do not. There's reasons we can get into for that, but however, for researchers and analytics, it's really important to bring all of that data together in one place. So we were basically looking for a solution to how do we join this assessment data from various vendors with all the other education data that we have in a data warehouse. And that's where the need for these tools arose.
What challenges do you see in interacting with those files that you get from vendors? So what are the, like, okay, we've got the language conversion, got the language pushing, but then how do you even know enough about the language that you're translating from to provide value to your intended audience?
That's a great question. So, well,
Can you give an example, Rob?
Yeah. So in my head, it's one thing to just say I can take this data element and put it there. It's another to say I know enough about what that data is for where it should go. So here's a score. I need to know what type of score it is, and then how that score is going to be then used by the audience so that I can make sure it gets to the right place. So given assessment data, what kinds of, well, maybe positives and some negatives that you've seen in the assessment data that have either presented challenges or opportunities in doing this Earthmover Lightbeam work?
sure. Well, so how do you approach that? I think is just with a lot of experience and looking at lots of assessment data and learning. Obviously, most assessment vendors publish sort of data dictionaries or some sort of details about the formats that they provide and what each column means and that sort of thing. But as far as how to translate that into something that's like you could compare two different assessments and make some sense of how they compare, that I think comes down to experience and analysis and just looking at a lot of it. One thing we have seen some vendors that do have EdFi integrations do is sort of take all of the assessment results and put them into these collections in EdFi. But that can be, as you point out, like hard to parse on the other end. Like a researcher will then see in the data warehouse a column that's called, performance level or something, but it might have values that aren't similar to performance levels of another assessment, or if it's a numeric value, it might be on a different scale than other values. So we typically try to, in the Earthmover transformation instructions, align those types of things and make sure it all fits together. One thing I'll say that's a challenge, I think, for anyone who works with assessment data is dealing with things like student identifiers. Those can come in different types. You might have a state identifier, a local identifier. Sometimes also those are filled in by the student, like bubbles on a Scantron, and so they can be prone to mistakes. And so just practically dealing with that and getting it to match up to an ID in EdFi can be a challenge. And we have some tooling and things for dealing with that.
This is maybe a question for Rosh, but previously to Earthmover and Lightbeam, we would use data import, which is an EdFi tool. Can you or either of you really give a kind of comparison to how they're different?
Yeah, I can talk about the olden days. So when we first started interacting with EdFi, I mean, assessment was on the very outer edges of getting data in. And as there was more of a need for that within the community, different types of tools started to pop up. In the very earliest days, that was gated behind proprietary software and using things like I think there's like a Altova XML Spy, which would take EdFi designations and then build a map using XML from the source data to EdFi and then convert it into EdFi XML, which was the original transfer format before the EdFi API was present. So that was basically the Earthmover portion of things is how do you reconcile these two data models one to another? And then in time, the need arose for there being more a wider audience to be able to do that work. And that's where the EdFi Alliance funded the work to create something called Data Import, which had a user interface. But it also required significant knowledge of a lot of things. Like you needed to know how EdFi worked. You needed to know how like PowerShell, Windows PowerShell work. There were a lot of in the weeds programming knowledge and technical knowledge that you needed to know to run it. So the intended audience was somebody in a school district, but there's very rarely somebody in the school district that has that combination of skills. We are fortunate that we did work with some school districts that did, but even then, adding that to their workflow was an unrealistic expectation. So it ended up being myself, a couple of other coworkers, sometimes Molly. We would run these different scripts. We would run PowerShell. We would look at the outputs. We would see issues. We would also be in the weeds of saying, we actually don't have enough time to build a map that data import would use. So we would work with another contractor through the EdFi Alliance. We would have lots of back and forth conversations, encounter the same kind of challenges as student IDs. And all of that was a multi-part effort, and we loaded data. I mean, we successfully did it, and we did some really cool things with showing those assessment results in the old EdFi dashboards, in the new dashboards that we created, just ad hoc reports. And we did a lot of work. What I've seen in the work that we've done at EA is the ability to scale that work and also allow a wider audience to be able to do that work. I think that's one of the important innovations here, is that you now have the usage of this is not like people that are really in the weeds of EdFi. We have a pretty wide user base of lots of varied usages of Earthmover Lightbeam out there for lots of different outcomes. And we were just dealing with assessment data, but there are several folks out in the community right now that aren't even directly partnered with us that are using this to get like student data into EdFi. And so this is general purpose tooling to go from one schema to EdFi. And then it's also, because of the particular tooling that it's built in Python. It's not proprietary software, it's fully open source. We maintain it actively. We invite others to contribute to that code base. There's lots of documentation. The one thing I appreciate about Tom, very detailed with documentation. And so for somebody to get into it and get started, the barrier is much lower than the older tools that we had to use. Not to say that they did what they were supposed to do, but it took us a lot of cycles to get them working just right. And even then, we had this wide network of support to make that work. And so that's been helpful for me. I've not been in the weeds doing the actual loading, but it's allowed us to move from how do we even get this in to what's the quality of what we're getting in. And that's a significant shift, because now we have the ability to have high level conversations at like the state level, with multiple districts coming to the roundtable and then discussing and saying, here's how we use assessment data. Can you get that in? What should that look like? Who should make the rules of what that should look like? Because the way in which you can land it in EdFi is pretty flexible, to Tom's point earlier. So that flexibility can work against you when you're trying to use that data. So there has to be some set of rules that govern not only the transformation of that data, but how it lands in EdFi and how then it impacts usage. So all those work together, and we were in those earlier stages, we were just very focused on particular sets of scores and being pretty narrow. But now that there's an opportunity to have that wider conversation, it presents a lot more opportunities for like more robust usage of this data in the future.
So at what point in like, let's say you have a new data set that you want to use Earthmover and Lightbeam for, what are kind of the steps to match those fields, or like just take us through the process a little bit, if that makes sense?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to any mapping process where you're first trying to identify the kind of top level resources or classes that correspond in meaning, and then you go through the properties and fields of each of those and do, descriptor mapping and all of the fun things we know we have to do for EdFi. There's, with assessment data in particular, there's some complexities that come up around the grain of assessment data. And just one example is In EdFi, we have the assessment resource and the objective assessment resource, and those have a hierarchical relationship. It's sort of an open question when you have a multi-part test with different subjects. Should those each be their own assessment? Should there be one containing assessment with different objective assessments inside of it? People might choose to model it differently. For analytical purposes, we have our own preferences in that regard. And my colleague Juliana Alvord on the data engineering team has developed a lot of documentation around that stuff and kind of beautiful diagrams showing the EdFi model and how a potential assessment would map to that. So it's definitely important, and not sometimes it's really straightforward. You know, this row of the spreadsheet goes to a student assessment record or something. But other times you need to do some fancy group buys and joining and various kind of transformation to get it to line up.
Yeah, that was a pain point in the data import days. There was a limit to how much you could do and account for in terms of if this is in this format, like how can you change it into the appropriate format to land to match a descriptor or whatever it was. So that's much wider. Can you walk us through, like, okay, once you have a conceptual mapping, like what's the actual steps to using Earthmover successfully? And I think Lightbeam, you can explain that too, but I think the process of going from this conceptual modeling to then the next technical step would be valuable to hear about.
Sure. Right. So that gets a little bit into this YAML configuration for Earthmover and how that works. So at a high level, that's a file where you specify three things. We call them sources, transformations, and destinations. So the sources would be your input file or files, say a CSV, maybe some descriptor mappings, things like that. Then transformations essentially take one or several of those inputs and do something to them. In SQL terms, that would be joins, group by statements, filtering, various types of operations like that. And then the destinations are where you actually output your JSON-lined files. So once you've got the data in the shape that it needs to be for EdFi, you can take each row of that data and turn it into a JSON payload, which you could then send to an EdFi API. So once you have this Earthmover YAML configuration, what you can then do is just Earthmover run at your command line, specify that YAML file, and it will take your source data that you've specified, do the transformations, produce the JSON lines, and you have EdFi JSON.
And how fast is that?
It depends. We're always
pushing. I know
pushing.
how fast data import was.
Yeah, we're always pushing on the performance. It has to do with both the size of your inputs. So if you're processing a really big assessment file, like, a district with 100,000 students, obviously that'll take a little while. Also, if the transformations you're doing are complex, like if you're doing a lot of joins, that can slow it down. But typically, I would say it's unusual for an Earthmover run to take longer than 20 or 30 minutes. And for small districts, small assessments, it's very, very much faster than that, seconds at times.
Yeah, way faster.
So running it overnight.
Yeah. So once you have those JSON-L files and you run Lightbeam, what's the utility of like running it through Lightbeam versus like using just curl commands to send that to EdFi?
Sure. I think one of the big advantages is scale. So depending again on how much assessment data you have, but you might be looking at many thousands of records, and sending those through curl even in a loop or something is just cumbersome. And then if you get any errors back from the EdFi API, logging those and reading through them is difficult. So Lightbeam takes care of a lot of that. It aggregates outputs and errors and gives you counts of different errors. Also, importantly, Lightbeam is asynchronous and concurrent, so it can send several requests, many requests to an EdFi API at the same time, and so then it completes faster as opposed to a serial execution. So there's a lot of advantages to using Lightbeam, in my opinion, but primarily they would be around scale and speed.
Yeah, so that's a major difference with data import too. Data import was both at the same time, so the actual transformations happened right before it would send, and it was kind of linear in how it worked. This gives you the option to run the transformations first, evaluate the transform data, make sure it's actually in the shape that you want, and then say, okay, I'm going to make this into scalable production and regularly import files and regularly send them and add them to an orchestrator like Airflow or something like that. So it gives you the options to chunk up the work and check your work along the way rather than wait and see
Wait
what
overnight
happens.
and see that it didn't work.
And then not work or it land and you unintentionally included the wrong ID format, and then you have to go and delete everything and redo everything, which has been done before. So not to say that you couldn't do that with Earthmover Lightbeam, but it at least gives you the kind of modularity to do it in 2 different steps.
Right, and those are kind of, I think, as say you have a brand new assessment that you want to work with, and you've built some Earthmover transformation instructions, and you've run them, and you have some JSON output. It looks okay, but you're not quite sure if it's right. So that's where the Lightbeam validate tool comes in really handy, because without actually sending it to an Edfi API and getting piles of errors or finding out it's wrong, you can do some sanity checks and make sure that it fits the basic requirements of that Edfi API and its required fields and things like that. So that's typically our process when we're building a new assessment package, is we develop the instructions and then kind of iteratively validate, fix a few things, validate, fix a few things, and then we know that it's good.
One of the things that I'm most excited about with Earthmover and Lightbeam is the ability to bring in data that doesn't come from a vendor source, but that might have been collected locally. It's a very promising tool for us to bring in those different parts of data that are not necessarily standardized by a system, but could be standardized by a human. In terms of like the structure of the file that you would be bringing in, or the structure of the data that you would be bringing in, I know like in data import, if it was very finicky in terms of whether it would accept certain things or not, like if you open them in Excel first, or are there certain things we should be aware of in terms of what kinds of, especially if you're making your own file, what kinds of things would you need to be thinking about when you're kind of designing that file?
So designing the transformation instructions, you mean?
Design like the data source.
Ah,
So for I'll give you a use case example. So we're hoping to do some analysis of data that includes local assessments. So those may not come from a vendor. They may be recorded just in a spreadsheet. So if we want to get those into the Edfi ODS, and especially if we're working with district folks about that, what do we need to be aware of in terms of formatting that file, things that will make it not work, things that will and also like if you have a really big file, lots of data points, but you only need a few of them, is it possible to just kind of select what you want?
yes, okay, that's helpful, thank you. So firstly, as a principle, I would say, whatever tool is being used to collect that local assessment data, presumably can export it,
Oh, I mean like a teacher
hand entered. Okay,
typing in,
okay.
yeah.
Sure, that's interesting.
Because some, especially if you're thinking about an assessment for young children, sometimes it's an observational assessment and the teacher is just entering in a rating. So, I mean, this tool lets us be really flexible with getting stuff like that,
sure.
but obviously there are things we want to be aware of
Yeah,
in the planning stages.
that's interesting. I'd actually be interested to hear what you think about this. Maybe before that, I'll just say that when I think about a problem like that, I usually go to what problem are we trying to solve? Who would be looking at that data ultimately? And some of that might influence both how you model it in Edfi and then also how you model the initial kind of capture mechanism.
Yeah.
But what would you
I think
say?
there's we've seen varied practices in different districts with how they meet the need of we have something that we want to capture about our students, but there's no tool off the shelf that can do that, or the instrument is paper pencil. And so the teachers are aggregating that by taking they're the human earth mover, right? They're taking the paper and they're putting it into a Google Sheet or an Excel document. What I think we're looking for is that are there some practices if your end target is EdFi? So there's already, let's assume that there's already a need that, okay, this district, this grouping of districts are wanting to use EdFi. They see value in seeing these locally collected assessments. Is there some like systematic approach that should be taken when we engage with those kinds of use cases to say, okay, if you want to get it in and use this interoperable layer, here's some must-haves. Like,
If we were to provide them a template,
yeah,
let's say.
yeah. Or if they
What do we
said,
need to be?
modify your columns? Like,
Sure.
what are some hiccups or what are some hitches that you see in just the normal day-to-day exploration and
Yes.
of like data modeling that says, okay, if we didn't have to deal with that, it would be a lot better. And if we have the ability to influence it at the local level, that's something that can maybe remove some downstream cycles of back and forth. So, like, what are some best
Absolutely.
practices that you've seen that say, okay, if you are curating a data source, what are some essential elements that should be there, and what are some things maybe you should avoid?
Yeah. So I think my colleague Jules would have a lot more to say on this. And actually, she has a really good recent blog post on our EA blog, which I would very much recommend to.
We'll put it in the show
Yeah.
notes. Yeah.
But a few things I've heard her say. Let's see. So one would be to be really careful about the student IDs and make sure those are entered carefully and to use a consistent one or supply several if there are. Another one that is, I thought, surprising is around dates. So often, I believe in EdFi, you are required to provide a date when the assessment was taken. However, some assessments do not provide that. It's well known that it was taken in the spring or the fall or whatever, but there's not a specific date.
Right.
And so something like that is easy to kind of trip up on. There's absolutely like little details like that that I think are important to consider. And a lot of them come from the EdFi model and what it requires.
If you don't have a date, are you able to substitute a dummy fake
Absolutely.
date? Okay.
But again, thinking about the end user, an analyst or a researcher who's looking at a data warehouse
Yeah.
and sees, oh, April 15th, they might think that that's actually April 15th and not.
So you want to make it very clearly wrong. Impossible.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so given that and like the need for transparency, can somebody see and evaluate what rules were used as so let's say you do insert a placeholder date when a date didn't exist. How would somebody know that and be able to like walk backwards and see, okay, is that the actual date that people did this, or did we make a tactical decision at some point in the chain?
Good question. So this is a great time to bring up, in addition to Earthmover and Lightbeam, the two tools, we have a suite of these transformation instructions for Earthmover for, I want to say, at least 20 different assessments now, and these are also all open source. And so someone could go to a particular assessment and read through those transformation instructions and see, how is the date populated here? Is it from some column of the assessment file, or is it created because we don't have one? So that sort of thing. And then often what we do downstream of EdFi, if we know for a particular assessment that the date was made up, say, is then in the data warehouse models and rules to kind of translate back to something that's more interpretable to an analyst.
Gotcha.
Yeah, all of those, we call them bundles. They're sort of like reusable packages, these instructions for converting a certain assessment standard output file to EdFi are all publicly available, and we use them, and we want the community to be able to use them as well.
Are either of you aware, are there other EdFi community members who've started using Earthmover Lightbeam?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because we try and foist. I'll not say we. I definitely try to foist this on as many use cases as I can. Maybe to the detriment of the Earthmover Lightbeam product. But I can cite just a couple of examples. One is there's a large district in Georgia. I'm not going to use their name because they're not our direct partner, but I also don't want to claim anything on their behalf. But They had a specific use case where they have their own homegrown data system and they needed to get that data to the state for state reporting. And they wanted to do it themselves. And so we gave them some very light support, really light support, like just maybe some Slack message, some email addresses. And they're actively using Earthmover and Lightbeam completely on their own. They wrote their own bundles, did some troubleshooting with us to get the format of those right and the Lightbeam usage correct. And then they're using it regularly to push data to the state. So far, I haven't heard any bad news yet, but that's one example of where there was this unique need, and they were uniquely talented to be able to take that and do it. I think that shouldn't be glossed over. Is that you do require some data modeling knowledge, and then also understanding of Python, and then understanding how to orchestrate data. And also, that's without even thinking about anything on the edfi side. It's like, how do you deal with the edfi errors? Because then you're the only one in the middle of like, what did I do wrong? So that's a district. I just had this conversation with somebody the other day.
Another example along those lines that I'm aware of is in the past we worked with a charter school district where some of the schools were in one greater district and others of the schools were in a different district, and one used edfi and one did not. And they wanted to bring all of their schools' data together, and so they had to translate some of the non-edfi data to edfi, and they used Earthmover and Lightbeam to do that. Yeah, I don't know. I think another example would be in one of our large state partners, there are vendors who are now developing edfi or Earthmover bundles to bring in different state assessments to edfi. So yeah, it's a growing group of people who are adopting these tools.
We had a unique situation in Texas where we didn't use the Earthmover part so much, but we used the Lightbeam to do some pruning of data in a particular edfi ODS, and that was not us. That was another group in the community that just picked it up and started using it again with some light support. But we're able to get going with just a vision and a direction. But then this tool enabled them to process some deletes that were kind of more challenging to do. They used a data source and then they kind of adapted it and they call it like batch beam and batch mover because they're doing it against large groups of data. So it's because it's open source, you can take it and adapt the code to exactly your limitations or affordances, and then you can modify it in whatever way you'd like. They're not restrictive on that particular. What license is it under? Is it just
Apache 2,
just Apache
open source
2?
license?
Is that the kind of thing where they might share that back, or like would we be interested in kind of including that in the growing suite of product or open source products?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge there is that sometimes what people are trying to integrate to edfi is a proprietary standard, in which case they may not want to share it back.
Sure.
But if it's a publicly available or widely known standard, I mean, we absolutely encourage that, you know, like for new assessments or whatever.
Yeah. I think the way in which we've licensed it allows people the freedom to participate or not.
Yeah.
I think one important thing is what I would want more collaboration on and more community surfacing is like the challenges encountered so that we start to have a growing list of patterns that we're accommodating with this tooling. To your point earlier, or your question earlier about like what should the format be for this local assessment? It's like, well, we can't individually, the three of us in this room, like assemble the whole list of all those things. But as the community branches out and we have the tree going into all these different varied environments, having them surface those and be vocal about it is what I would encourage. Less so like be so much like contribute your code back. It's more like, hey, engage in the conversation about these gnarly data things that you find out in the field, and what you're using this tooling for is something that I would love to have deeper engagement on.
Absolutely. I mean, as a developer of tooling, the best thing I can get is feedback about how people are using it and how it's breaking. And my team, we all lurk in the edfi Slack, and we've had people like say, "Hey, what is this Earthmover thing? And can you help us?" And
yeah, let me tell you.
We help them out. So that's absolutely great feedback, and that's how we push the tools forward and improve them.
Yeah, I'll make a pitch too for somebody that's maybe entering the edfi space. Maybe you're a vendor or like you're just a tinkerer. if you're interested in supporting EdFi or saying that you want an EdFi badge, I would venture to say like do your early experimentation with Earthmover Lightbeam. It gives you valuable feedback about like your own data. It gives you an understanding about the destination data structure. And then it's licensed in a way that you could adopt it as part of your stack. So that is something that we are also encouraging people to do. To Tom's point earlier, there's not a ton of people that have a native assessment integration. And we've seen in certain states, like in Texas, HR and finance vendors are also pushing data to EdFi. And as we continue to widen the group of types of vendors, we need to, as a community, continue to provide more accessible entry points for somebody to integrate because it is challenging, it is time consuming, and it takes funding. And we're all in short supply of most of those things. So,
especially for new areas where there's not even a example to work from.
Yeah, I think a good new example is in the most recent version of EdFi, there's a student health domain that's for vaccinations. So this is a great opportunity to knit together two standards bodies. So in healthcare, you have lots of standards that apply to this kind of data, and you have EdFi. And now that you have a location, we should all come together and have a canonical mapping, which could be encapsulated in a bundle. And then you could take that bundle as a vendor and just base your mappings off of that. You don't even have to use Earthmover Lightbeam. One thing that we're trying to push for in our collaborative environment in South Carolina, working with other vendors, we're now taking those rules that Juliana has kind of fostered and curated, and now those are encapsulated in these bundles that have very similar approaches, but written by different people. So that community building around the business logic of what data gets into EdFi and how you construct it is, I think, a valuable marker of progress in this community. We're not just focused on getting data in, we're focused on the quality of data and the replicability of that data over time and how it evolves. So that's a really great sign. But now it's like there is a risk of us now having these more accessible tools going off and doing our own things and actually not using interoperability for the benefit of the whole. And so I think now is we've standardized the transport mechanisms, we've standardized tooling. Now we need to standardize practices. It's probably more difficult to do because there's people involved, but that's the opportunity that we have in front of us, and tools like what you guys have created is great.
Yeah, and along those lines, I'll point out that these bundles we're talking about, the open source transformation instructions, live on GitHub in a public repository where Juliana has got a README with some basic information about bundles and how to build one, as well as links to really in-depth documentation on how to do some of this complex mapping and trying to standardize the governance and all of that. So
that's a good jump off to like, okay, if somebody's interested, where do they go, and then what is available for them to get started with this? And you mentioned like a couple of things like be validate and things like that. Like how would somebody know those things?
Right. So all of these things, Earthmover and Lightbeam, are open source repositories in GitHub, and we try to keep good documentation there. So there's READMEs in the repos that explain in detail how the tools work, how to set up these configuration files, how to run them, some information about like project structure and what kinds of errors you might encounter and what all the command line flags are, just lots of detail. I think we're working on actually soon to come some nicer Earthmover documentation that's like searchable and just has more examples and things like that. Aside from that, I think again, feel free to reach out to folks at EA and they'll point you in the right direction. The advice Slack, like we want these tools to become useful to the community,
and we'll put all the things you mentioned in the show notes as well, so that folks can find them easily. There's a third tool that we haven't talked about, which is newer, right? Runway, and that makes this a little more accessible at the district level, right? So I think we have time, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about that.
Yeah, so that addresses one of so in some ways the advantages of Earthmover and Lightbeam over something like Data Import Tool are easier to scale and cross-platform support, things like that. The disadvantage is there is no UI. So if you are a non-technical user, there's no buttons to click. You have to type into a command line terminal. So that's what Runway tries to address. Is it's an app that essentially gives a web-based UI on top of Earthmover and Lightbeam, and tries to make it easy to like drag drop your assessment file, select what kind of assessment it is, click a button, and then it goes to your ODS. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've been working on internally for a while. It's kind of being piloted, and I think more to come on that soon.
And that will also be open source.
I believe that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not completely sure if I can
Think
commit to
so.
it. Yeah.
I should know the answer to this question, but I believe the objective is once it's in a particular state to make it open source.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious, at some point it would be great to be able to see a demo of like what does it actually take to do that as a district employee or anyone really. I mean,
Yeah, our
this
first
goes
production release is in Texas, so
this goes
we're-
beyond districts, right? It's very generalizable.
Yeah, and also I believe, I don't think I'm spoiling any secrets here, that the goal eventually is to deploy that in South Carolina too, where they have a lot of assessment data, historical assessment data, many assessments, and my colleague Jay, who also helped develop these tools, has been burning the midnight oil at loading assessments sort of manually. So yeah, to have a UI where district folks themselves can log in and just upload a file and do all of Jay's work for him would be fantastic.
Yeah. I think that's another kind of unseen value of tooling like this. And as you add more accessible interfaces to it, is it doesn't just help like an external user, but also internal users. We can widen the work base that can work on it, because when you're collapsing it onto just a J, one, it's not great for that person as an individual. But two, it also like puts the failure points in one person's purview. So if there is something that's going to fail, well, Jay, if he's overloaded and looking at things, well, sometimes something might fall off the radar. So getting more eyes, distributing the workload are also things that we're hopeful for Runway to enable, is to say, okay, there's a non-engineer, but somebody that's really familiar with the process, and they can actually start assisting a district in loading it, or train them, or whatever it is, and move it out of the realm of a purely developer-driven workflow.
And along with all of that comes many challenges that we are in the works, trying to solve around, like, you get an EdFi API error. At best, a technical person might struggle to figure out what that means, but now you're going to maybe show it in a UI to a district administrator or something. And so trying to make those things interpretable and fixable, and figure out when to bring in, an escalation path and stuff is all challenging, and things we're excited to work on.
That's great. I mean, thinking about all the things that we heard from districts over our first few years working in Indiana, every district has at least one assessment that doesn't come from a vendor system, or maybe it comes from a vendor system, but it's not on anyone's priority list to write a data import thing. Those are more a heavier lift than the Earthmover Lightbeam bundles, it sounds like. So it just really enables so many. I mean, it solves so many of those issues that that seemed like they should be easy to fix and weren't. But how do you get this other piece of data in? Well, we can't, and that was really hard to say for many years, and now you don't have to say that. That's earth moving.
Not
even the dad in this room.
Excellent.
Well, any kind of final words, Tom, or like words of encouragement for those that are listening to this and are like engaged and interested in the work, but then from your standpoint, I know you say like you're behind the scenes, but I feel like you've been part of innovation in this space, and like where does that come from? We really didn't poke into much of your background, but it's like, why do you do this? And maybe a word of encouragement for others that are out there that are interested in this and or maybe like looking for a spark.
Right. Well, that's a broad question. Well, I mean, the reason that I studied computer science in school is because I think computers are amazing. Just the amount of work that they can do compared to what we used to be able to do is phenomenal. But sometimes that can be sort of theoretical and academic and just a fun puzzle. But with this kind of a thing, it seems like there's the potential for tremendous impact on real students' lives. And
Sometimes fun puzzles have impact, and that's great.
so that's my encouragement, I guess, is this is not only fun and cool, cutting edge ed tech stuff to work on. It's also like more deeply impactful than that. And I really love working on this stuff for those reasons. So my encouragement would be, try these things out. And if you're not super technical, then keep an ear out for Runway and other more to come.
Yeah. I mean, yesterday we were listening to your tech talks, and I sent Rosh a message and was like, "Do you think we could use this for XYZ?" And he was like, "Yeah." Like, that's so cool.
And that's
like,
the power of like connecting people and ideas.
Yeah, like I never thought of that as an option for solving this problem I have on my research and analytics business line, which, you don't necessarily think of that as being related to what you're doing on the engineering line. So
yeah, we've had several of these podcasts where we kind of have this like the work that we're doing in a silo is like technical work, maybe contract work. But the reason that we're all at this organization in particular is that we all have a vision for the impact and mission. And like Jay, if you're listening to this, probably not. But if you end up listening to
I'll
this,
tell him
like,
to listen to it.
Yeah, in a few years, all this data that you've loaded, assessment data, there's going to be some researcher or some practitioner that's going to use it and then have something that they do that will enable a student's life to be better. And I think that's like when we're down, I was using this word yesterday, like when we're down in the muck, like it's really hard to see where you're going. But in a couple of years, we'll be able to look back and say, like, that was really worth it because of this. And even if it's just a one outcome, like that's one life changed. That's I think the encouraging part of this work, even though it's sometimes very frustrating and time consuming.
Yeah. So I would like to just end with a note of gratitude and thank my colleagues, Eric Jornalin, who inspired this work and asked me to start on it, and Jules Salvard, who is leading the way on these bundle development, Jay Kaiser, who helped a lot with Earthmover and make that code prettier and more efficient, and the rest of my data engineering team, and then also you, Rosh and Molly, for inviting me to talk about it here.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
One of the coolest things that, I've learned about at EA recently. So, all right. Well, we'll call that an episode.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank
you.